Hey, so in this chapter you will learn how to create an outfit in Marvelous Designer. For the sake of clarity, I will create a rather simple outfit, since a complex clothes pattern might be rather time-consuming and confusing further down the road. My main goal is to show you the process and explain which decisions you will have to make. Feel free to experiment and add your own spin to your outfit. You don't have to recreate what I'm doing. So in the pipeline, we are at the step of creating a high poly cloth mesh. I will create all soft cloth parts of the outfit in Marvelous Designer and then add some additional items like belts, shoes and some accessories in Blender. Alright, first of all we need to export our avatar model as an OBJ file. Now let's open up Marvelous Designer. The software comes with a couple of different avatars, but since we want our clothes to fit our specific character, we have the option to use our OBJ file as a custom avatar. To do this, click on the plus icon here and locate the folder where you exported the OBJ file to. This folder will then appear in the list of favorites here. Open it up, locate your OBJ file and drop it into the scene. You can adjust the look of the avatar in the Properties panel here. Let's brighten the color a little to get a better contrast for the clothes. For those who are new to the software, in Marvelous Designer you work simultaneously in the 3D and 2D pattern windows. You basically create your pattern, sewing lines, etc. in the 2D window and then arrange, pull and adjust the fabrics in the 3D window. Once an item has been placed in the 3D space, you can move it anywhere in 2D space, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's just work on the clothes and learn the different functionalities of Marvelous Designer as we go along. I will first make some pants. So I create a rectangle. If you ever need a reference, by the way, on how to make a pattern for pants, t-shirts, sleeves or skirts, you can always drop in one of the default garments that come with the software. Let's take those pants for example and add them to the scene. Set the load type to add instead of open, otherwise it will replace your own items instead of just adding it. Okay, so this is what a pants shape should look like. I'll delete it and continue with my rectangle, but you can also just take the pants and simply adjust them to your liking. So I add an additional point on the segment here, move it in place and then use the Edit Curvature tool to adjust the shape. Then I would like to mirror this piece. To do that you can right click on it and then select Symmetric Pattern with Sewing. For the back part, I just duplicate those two pieces and move them into place in 3D space. And now we just need to sew it together. If you are ever confused which segments need to be sewn together, there is a dot that appears in both windows wherever you click in the 3D window. If I click here, I see that this corresponds to this segment. And the back side corresponds to this one. So I know I need to sew those two parts together. And since we cloned the pattern with sewing, the mirrored part will automatically get the sewing lines. Now we can press the space bar to start the cloth simulation. The lower part sticks through the legs, so let's pull it out. Just click and drag anywhere on the garment while the simulation is running to adjust the clothes. Now let's see how we can control the resolution or poly count of the clothes. To see the actual geometry, we can switch here from textured surface to wireframe on surface in the viewport. This looks okay, but we want to have small folds and wrinkles, so let's increase the resolution. In Marvelous, this is controlled by this parameter called particle distance. On default, it is always set to 20. Let's set it to 5 and simulate again. Now that looks a lot better. The more vertices Marvelous has to work with, the slower the simulation will become, however. So it's good practice to create all the clothes items you need first and then decrease the particle distance toward the end before exporting. Let's set it back to 20 for now. To be able to see the different materials better, we can give the clothes a different color. I'm not going for a particular final look here, it's just a visual guide while we work in Marvelous. Next I will create a top and bottom part for the pants. When I try to simulate, the object seems to have a collision going on. This will be instantly fixed when we sew those parts together, but if you need to overlay clothes items, you can work with layers. The pants are set to layer 0, so we will set this top part to layer 1 and the collision disappears. I would like the sew lines to be on the side of the character, so I could rotate and reposition this part, but Marvelous has another beautiful feature. Every avatar has so-called arrangement points. You can activate them here. Now if you select an object and click on one of the points, it will nicely arrange it around the character mesh. Before simulating, let's add the sewing lines. Because I only have one segment on the top part, but two corresponding segments on the pants, I like to work with free sewing. Because I have cloned the top piece with linked sewing, I get unwanted sewing lines, so I have to remove linked editing for this piece in the right-click menu options. You can always adjust the size of your pieces in the 2D window. Now I assign a different material to the top part. This top part should be a bit thicker, so we can adjust the thickness and the material properties of the fabric. For the bottom part, instead of creating new rectangles, I will show you a different option. Click on Edit Pattern, select the bottom edges and right-click on them. Now you can select Offset as internal line. I will set the distance to 35 and we can now use those internal lines to cut and sew and assign the thick material to the separated parts. Next, I want to create a vest. For this one I will use one of the preset garments instead of creating it from scratch. I will choose this one and drop it in the scene. Again, set the load type to add and click OK. Let's simulate and see how it fits. And set the layer to 2. So we avoid the clipping issues with the pants. Now I am just adjusting the pattern and create a thicker border by using the internal lines function. You can always adjust the sewing, by the way. For example, I would like the vest to be open on the top part here, so I can select Edit Sewing in the 2D window and then just change the sewing lines or delete them. Instead of offsetting internal lines, you can also create them yourself. This is what I do here to extend the thick border along the V-neck part. For things like wraps around the arm, I cheat a little. I usually create a bunch of single wraps and then pull them into position so it looks like it's a single cloth wrapped all around the arm. To avoid collisions, I set every piece on a separate layer. At this point I would like to see more detail, so I will decrease the particle distance of the clothes. You can hide cloth parts, by the way, by selecting them and then pressing Shift-Q. I set the particle distance for the pants to 5 and increased the shrinkage warp and shrinkage weft a bit to get a more relaxed fabric with nice little folds. You can play around with those parameter values and see how it looks. I want the vest to look rather stiff, maybe I will apply a leather texture to it later, so I leave the particle distance at 20. Right, maybe we can add stockings as well, which will then later go into the shoes, which we will model in Blender. I'm quite happy with the output so far. Now comes the question, how can we introduce top stitches? There are basically two ways to deal with such details. Option 1. We can add top stitching here in Marvelous Designer. However, when we export the clothes mesh with stitches, every single thread will be exported as geometry, which can easily increase the poly count of your clothes into millions of triangles. So if we add stitches in Marvelous, the only really viable way forward will be to bake the high poly geometry into the normal map of our low poly model. That's of course no problem at all, but it has one downside. If you want the stitches to have a different color than the main fabric, you will have to hand paint every thread in Substance Painter, since we can't separate them by material. Option 2 is we paint stitches in Substance Painter directly, or generate them procedurally. Then we can use height information to make them look more realistic. And of course we can combine both options. I will show you both options. So here's how to add top stitches to the clothes. Select Segment Top Stitch in this drop-down menu and then just click on any segment of your garment pattern. The default stitch is quite small, so you have to really zoom in order to see it. But you can change the preset if you go to Hardware and Trims, then the Top Stitch folder, and there you have a couple of different versions that you can assign. You can either drag and drop the top stitch into the 2D window, or you can go to Edit Top Stitch, box select the segments you want to change, and then select something else, for example, the 2 single heavy top stitch that I already had assigned to one of the segments. Let's do that for the rest of the garments as well. Next, I will show you one way to make pockets and zippers. Create an internal shape where you want your pockets to be. Then right-click on it and select Clone as Pattern. This will create a cloth piece in exactly the shape of the internal line. The pocket pieces will usually end up somewhere in 3D space far away from the avatar, but there is a nice feature to place them on top of the internal line. First, stitch the pockets to the internal shape, and then right-click on the cloth in the 3D window and select Superimpose Over. Our vest is on layer 2, so we need to set the pockets to layer 3 and then simulate. So these are not real pockets yet, since they have no opening. Let's create an internal shape again, convert it to a hole and close it by using the zipper tool in the 3D window. It's a bit too wide, so let's adjust the width to 3 mm. As the final cloth item, I will create a cape, since we will want to use Unreal's cloth simulation feature for our character later on. Create a rectangle, bring it to the back and shape it how you like it. To make it stick to the body, you can use the Tack feature. You can either tack your clothes to the avatar himself or to another piece of cloth. I will select the cloth tack and pin the 2 corners of the cape to the chest. Then simulate and adjust the look of the cape if you like. As before, I will create a thicker border for the cape cloth and add some top stitching to it. Before exporting, it is helpful to unfreeze everything and run the simulation for a few short seconds, just to make sure that all the seams close up and there are no gaps between cloth pieces. Now we can export our mesh. For export you have different options. Select all patterns. Yes, we want to select all garments. Select all avatars. No, we don't need the avatar. Select all graphics and trims. This will export all buttons and top stitches. Then we can export the clothes as a single object or split them into multiple objects. For this option we want them as a single object. Next we can select whether we want to export the clothes as thin or thick objects. I will show you the difference in a moment. And lastly, we can choose to export the texture maps and UV layout of the clothes. Let's see what those different options do. I will first export the thick geometry with top stitches. We haven't worked on the UV layout yet, so I will ignore this option for now. If we import the OBJ in Blender, we get almost 4 million trees, including the character model. The thick parts of the clothes are nicely separated with beveled edges and it looks just nice. But this is definitely too many polygons for us to handle in a skeletal mesh. Let's see what we get without the dense top stitch geometry. Let's export with the same settings but uncheck the graphics and trims option. Now the clothes have only about 600k triangles. But all clothes have an outside and inside mesh. As you know, with this type of geometry, you usually run into all kind of problems in Substance Painter, but especially you get lots of clipping issues when you try to animate the mesh. Now let's export the clothes without thickness. All the clothes are now a normal mesh, just how you would get it if you had modeled the clothes in Blender. This is great, and the poly count is only 200k. Now if you look at the UVs, you will see a total mess of overlapping UV islands. Let's fix this. First we need to change the 2D pattern window to UV editor. Right-click somewhere in the empty space and choose Reset UV to 2D arrangement. This will give you exactly the same layout as you had in the 2D pattern window. And now we can start working on the UV tiles. Every square that you see here in the UV editor corresponds to one UDIM tile. I will select all patterns and move them out of the way first. And now I can select specific cloth items and assign them to the 01 UV tile. Right-click on the selection and choose Fit UV to 01. You can move patterns around, change their size and optimize the UV space. Ideally, you don't want too much precious UV space wasted, since this will impact the texture resolution later. However, we will create additional items in Blender such as shoes, belts, a helmet and so on, so we will fill the empty space later. I don't worry about that for now. Now we can select the Unified UV Coordinates option in the Export dialog. In the Export folder, you will get lots of PNG files along with the OBJ now, which are the texture maps. Since we did not apply any textures in Marvelous but will create our own custom textures in Substance Painter later, we don't care about these files at all and can actually delete them. What's important is that now we have a clean mid-poly clothes mesh in Blender with our UV layout we just created. Why is this necessary, by the way? Well, if you plan to retopologize your clothes mesh, the UVs will be lost anyway. You will have to create new seams in your retopologized mesh and UV unwrap it from scratch. But with only 200k triangles, we could actually just as well leave the mesh as it is and use it as our clothes mesh further down the pipeline. This totally depends on how dense your mesh is and how many puzzle pieces you have. For a simple garment pattern like this one, retopology is easily done. We could as well do it. But if you have dozens of small pieces, this can become quite cumbersome. And also, if nothing else, separating the cloth pieces in UV space makes it much easier to select specific mesh parts in Blender for further processing, like assigning materials and other operations. The choice is yours and will depend on the specific clothes model you created. I just want to point out to you that sometimes you don't lose anything in terms of quality if you decide to skip the retopology step altogether and just continue with your clothes mesh straight from Marvelous Designer. In the next chapter we will build upon our clothes model, create shoes for the character and different additional cloth items and accessories. I will also quickly show you how you could create a soft cloth model directly in Blender, or 3D Code or ZBrush or any other modeling tool you prefer, without Marvelous Designer. See you there!